How's everybody doing? This is my third lecture in my series on Latin American politics. In today's lecture, I'm going to discuss the origins of Spanish colonization in Latin America. So let's get to it. So what we're going to be doing in this lecture is understanding how and why colonization takes place. So this means understanding the means by which it takes place, as well as the motives for it as well. We're going to understand how and why Spain specifically colonized the Americas, right? So we can't understand Latin American politics today without understanding this important historical epoch and the impact it has had on the present day. So we're going to understand what impact this had on the indigenous peoples. And the process, we're going to understand how smaller militaries, in terms of population, can defeat much larger ones, right? So we're going to look at how the Spanish, with very small forces of conquistadors, conquered the Incan and Aztec empires. So to get this discussion started, we're going to first discuss this concept, colonialism, right? We have to understand what it is. Now, tied to this concept is the related concept of imperialism. That's quite simply when one country conquers another, right? So when Nazi Germany conquered all of Europe or most of Europe, right? So that's imperialism. When the British went out and conquered half of the globe, right? That's an example of imperialism. Well, of course, the Spanish conquest of the parts of the New World, right, of what we now know today as most of Latin America, constitutes one form of imperialism. Now, colonialism specifically is when, after the conquest, those imperialists, those conquerors, then settle people in the new colony. Right. So when the Spanish settled Spaniards in the New World, in most of what is today Latin America, that constitutes colonialism. The British, conquest of what would become the 13 colonies and the mass migration of people from England, Scotland, Wales, from Ireland over to those colonies, that also constitutes colonialism as well. Now, when this happens, okay, oftentimes what happens is the indigenous people, that is the original inhabitants, they either get partially or completely eliminated. And when the colonizer deliberately tries to eliminate the indigenous population, we refer to this as genocide, okay? Now, it's not always the case that the whole population gets eliminated, but sometimes it does take place. As you're going to find out with Latin America, some indigenous populations did get wiped out, others survived. Now, it could also involve as well the partial or complete elimination of an indigenous culture. While an indigenous people might survive, they might lose a lot, if not all of their culture in the process, including their languages, their religions, their way of life. And in the case of indigenous peoples, they lost many aspects of their culture, but they kept many aspects as well in Latin America. And they, in fact, would even influence the Spaniards who would come and settle in that part of the world. Now, for colonization to take place, okay, it requires a variety of what we call push factors, that is, things that push those colonizers outside of their motherland, and pull factors, things that pull them to that new homeland. And it also, as well, requires a significant amount of resources, strategic planning, and sometimes a bit of luck as well. Colonization is often expensive and it can be incredibly dangerous as well, right? It often requires conquest, warfare, traveling across great distances. Thus, a bunch of push and pull factors are needed. Now, for colonization to take place, the colonizers do need to have some degree of having more political and economic power than the indigenous peoples they're conquering, right? This might mean greater military technology. It might mean having more access to certain types of economic resources. It could also involve as well things like luck. The spread of disease, as you're going to find out, is going to play an important role in the Spanish colonization of the Americas. So power dynamics is involved here. Motives are also needed as well. The colonizers are often, for example, seeking access to economic fortunes, gold, silver, access to new agricultural lands. So there's often economic motive as to why they engage in colonization. Oftentimes there's a cultural motive as well. Sometimes they're competing to spread some type of ideology with their competitors or a religious faith. They're engaging in missionary work. This is something that can motivate them. And political power as well. If they're competing with other actors for power, this could also inspire them to go out and get colonies. And so thus, those kind of push and pull factors can involve increasing wealth and political power. Now, the violence itself with colonization, as you're going to find out, also requires justification, right? Human beings, when they engage in acts of violence, they often try to create some ideological facade to justify it. This could be, spreading a religious faith or spreading an ideology. And in the case of the Spanish conquest of the Americas, the spread of Christianity was often used to justify the mass murder of indigenous peoples, the exploitation of their labor, in order to be able to exploit resources like gold and silver and cash crops in the New World. So we are going to specifically hone in here on the Spanish first, and next lecture, I'm going to talk a lot about the Portuguese. Now, Spain is a country that's located in Western Europe, specifically in the Iberian Peninsula. As we talked about last time, it is a Latin-speaking country. They speak the Spanish language, most of the people in Spain today, with some exceptions. And during the process of the late 15th to the 16th century, this medium-sized country became a global superpower. And for the next couple of centuries, they're going to have one of the world's largest empires. This is what that empire looked like at the height of the Spanish conquests of different parts of the world. Specifically, much of the New World here, as you can see in red, as well as in some parts of the Pacific Ocean, such as the Philippines and various islands, and some islands as well, as you can see here off the coast of Northwest Africa, specifically the Canary Islands. So the Spanish had a massive empire. Now, just a couple of quick words about this map. It doesn't really fully reflect where exactly the Spanish settled. Many of these lands the Spanish held claims to, but never actually moved settlers into. This is the case in here, some of these lands in North America you see here in the far north, as well as in the far south in South America, for example. You didn't have many Spanish settlers that actually effectively moved there. But overall, this was a very large empire. So we want to try to understand why it was established and what impact it had on the peoples they conquered. So part of what drove the Spanish are part of a similar set of motives that drove other European colonial empires, like the Portuguese, the French, the British, and the Dutch. Part of this had to do with the very radical dynamics that were taking place across Europe in the midst of the last millennium, especially between the 15th and 16th centuries, okay, where the emergence of modern states was taking place. During this era in Europe, their economies were growing quickly because of the commercial revolution. Cities were growing, trade was growing, so too were the riches of monarchs throughout the continent, especially in Western Europe. And on top of that, those monarchs were engaging in increasingly intense warfare with one another. And as their warfare was intensifying, their weapons were growing ever more sophisticated. And these kings were investing in modern universities. They were investing as well in technological development in modern weaponry. And the most important weapon that emerged was that of gunpowder. And gunpowder, of course, very valuable for kings, for developing armies that have greater killing capacity, that can knock down the castles of lords that refuse to pay their taxes. And it can be used as well to quickly defeat various peoples throughout the world that don't have access to guns. And so these European powers, not only were they competing with each other in mainland Europe for territory, for power, they also began to go overseas to compete for colonies, not only in the Americas, but elsewhere across the globe. And part of fighting wars as well, part of the challenge with them is finding the money to fight wars. Wars are expensive. You have to pay your troops, you have to pay for the weapons, you have to feed your troops, you have to clothe them. So you need access to currency. And in those days, getting access to gold and silver was a way to be able for a monarch to be able to pay for troops, pay for mercenaries, to increase the size of their militaries. And while certainly the economic growth in Europe was helping with this, going overseas, finding access to new trade routes, as well as gaining access to gold and silver, and growing cash crops like sugar and tobacco was a way to earn hard currency. So many European powers established colonies to be able to gain access to new sources of wealth. And so these 5 countries became the 5 big players throughout the course of the 15th, 16th, 17th century that are going to develop empires. Spain and Portugal were really the first that were on top of it in the New World. Then the British, French, and Dutch followed afterwards. So that was part of the motivation, right? You got these intensifying wars and this need for resources to pay for them. Part of it as well had to do with competition over spreading different varieties of Christianity. Now, before the 16th century, the vast majority of Europeans in Western Europe were Catholic Christians. Right, so Catholicism had this traditional hierarchy with the Pope and the bishops on top and the lay priests in the middle, and then finally the religious believers at the bottom. And in the Catholic Church, only the priests and those on top of the religious hierarchy had the right to interpret the Bible. In fact, the Bible was written in an archaic language, Latin, that only the elites knew how to read. The vast majority of the peasantry couldn't read or write, never mind reading in an archaic language like Latin. So thus in the Catholic Church, the priest had a monopoly on interpretation of religious doctrine. It was also a hierarchically organized church, and one that as well that grew increasingly corrupt as it gained access to greater resources during the course of the commercial revolution. And as Europe began to become more urbanized and as educational rates started to grow, its middle class started to grow, many well-educated people during the commercial revolution started to question why the Catholic Church should have a monopoly on interpretation. They began to question the corruption of the Catholic Church, the selling of indulgences to forgive rich people of their sins. So these things drew a lot of anger amongst much of the middle class in Europe during this era. And in fact, a revolution broke out known as the Protestant Reformation, led by a priest named Martin Luther in Germany in the early 16th century. This inspired the establishment of independent Protestant churches that interpreted the Bible in all sorts of ways. And more importantly, they encouraged people to read the Bible for themselves. They printed the Bible in different languages like English, German, and so on and so forth with the help of the printing press. And thus, there started a conflict between Protestants and the old Catholic establishment that became tied into these wars throughout Europe. Wars such as the 30 Years' War, for example, where Protestants and Catholics competed to spread their faith in mainland Europe and eventually elsewhere throughout the globe. So Spain, France, and Portugal remained majority Catholic by the end of this era. But the English and the Dutch are going to eventually become majority Protestant. And so for the Spanish, French, and Portuguese, they sought to spread Catholicism through missionary work and warfare to different parts of the globe. And the same was true of the British and Dutch as well. So missionaries became entangled with politics to spread their faiths. Now, last but not least, we get the commercial revolution. Was a big motive for this conquest. During the commercial revolution, we begin to see the development of long-distance trade networks and banking. And by establishing colonies overseas, those became places where you could invest your money and make a profit in mining and growing cash crops like sugar. And on top of that as well, the commercial revolution led to the innovation of all new sorts of shipping technologies, such as the caravel. These ships with these large sails had the ability to sail across the Atlantic Ocean and to sail as well around the African continent to the Indian Ocean and beyond. So this enabled for Europeans to colonize long distance lands throughout the globe. And it also fed as well into this European hunger for access to more land and gold. Populations were growing throughout Europe. There was growing demand for land, access to resources. Colonization became one way to satiate these desires. Now, just a couple of cool things I want to show you here, just to show you how really technological development in warfare started to become transformed in the 1400s. Take a look here. Before this, weapons tended to be they had less killing capacity. They as well tended to be kind of these handmade weapons, things like the English longbow, for example, swords, bows and arrows, right? Hand-to-hand combat was the name of the game. But with the invention of gunpowder, suddenly you could kill larger numbers of people and you could cause a lot more havoc and destruction. So we could see here, and since then, the rate of technological development with weapons grew exponentially after this, especially with the coming of the scientific revolution. And so we begin to see weapons of greater killing capacity emerge in the following centuries. This gave Europeans a lot of power. Now, just to kind of display to you the religious dynamics of Europe, you could see here in the southern part of Europe, Spain, France, and Portugal here are Latin countries, remained Catholic, as did Italy. But the countries to the north, such as the UK, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, they became majority Protestant. And so this was part of that greater struggle there. And so from 1492 to the 18th century, these five big countries that we talked about colonized the New World. So we got here the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British, the French, and the Dutch. Okay, each taking their own little slice of the New World in the process. And by the way, this is the caravel, the ship that enabled them to initially make that journey. And so while that journey initially took many, many weeks, eventually in world history, by the time we get to the 19th century with the steamboat, that trip will be cut down to a number of days. So with growth and advancements in shipping technology, this enabled Europeans to traverse the Atlantic Ocean. Now, what were the motives specific to Spain? So Spain as well had some relatively specific motives of its own, unique to its history. Now, Spain is part of the Iberian Peninsula, and really civilization, large towns and cities first emerged during the days of the Roman Empire. So, of course, Spain was one of the Latin-speaking countries, right? So when the Roman Empire collapsed, eventually a different set of invaders would enter the Iberian Peninsula, the most important of which were Muslim invaders from the Middle East and North Africa. So Arab Muslims crossed over the Strait of Gibraltar from North Africa to Spain and conquered it in 711 AD. And over the next several centuries, Spain would be ruled by a series of different Muslim empires. And thus the Christians would be driven back. Now, since that Muslim conquest, though, the Christian kingdoms to the north would engage in various efforts to try to retake the peninsula. They engaged in various wars with these Muslim kingdoms. Now, I don't want to oversimplify this era. Muslim kingdoms also fought amongst themselves, and sometimes Christians even made alliances with those Muslim kingdoms. But overall, there was a lot of efforts by Christian kingdoms to the north to re-Christianize the Iberian Peninsula, to reconquer it, hence Reconquista. And this took several centuries for this to take place. In fact, it was only completed in 1492. It was part of this larger effort that you might know as the Crusades, right? To take Christians' lands back from the Muslim peoples. But the last Muslim kingdom was defeated in Spain. It was known as Granada. It was defeated in 1492. Not coincidentally, the very same year, Columbus would sail to the Americas. Now, by the time of this conquest, two monarchies coalesced on the Iberian Peninsula. One was the Portuguese. We'll talk about them next time. The other was the Spanish. They formed out of an alliance of different monarchies in the rest of the Iberian Peninsula. And by 1492, Spain was led by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Now, because of the religious fervor of this conquest, eventually Muslims and Jews were expelled from Iberia after centuries of the mixing of Muslims, Jews, and Christians on this peninsula. In the decades after 1492, they would eventually be expelled. In fact, Muslims and Jews would not be allowed by the Spanish monarchy to travel to the New World. Only Christians would be allowed. So thus, their conquest of the New World was driven by a really unique fervor to spread the Christian faith. It's a big part of the establishment of the Spanish monarchy, the Spanish polity. And the Spanish as well, in the ensuing centuries, would compete with other European monarchs to protect Catholicism and to spread it in other parts of the European continent as well. Now, a couple of other things here that relate to the Iberian Peninsula that are important. It was actually the Portuguese that were the first to make long distance journeys in the search for new trade routes and access to resources. And they began to sail first around the African continent, kind of a safe way to attempt to sail to the Indian Ocean, as opposed to risking going out into the Atlantic Ocean to get to East Asia and India to trade for things like spices, gold, silver, and slaves. They decided to take this route around the African continent and establish these coastal colonies in the process, right? So their motives to do this were to outcompete the Muslims in terms of long distance trade in Eurasia and gain wealth. And the Spanish eventually followed along, and they are eventually in 1492 going to take a very big gamble. And that year, a young explorer from the Italian town of Genoa named Christopher Columbus is going to knock on the doors of the Spanish monarchy. And he is going to try to convince them to take a risk, to take a bunch of ships and go across the Atlantic to reach East Asia and India. Now, Columbus had underestimated how long this journey would actually take place. He was a bit overconfident in his ability to reach East Asia with the current state of technology. And on top of that as well, he was a big believer in his own sense of self-importance, big ego. He sought wealth, political power. He was also motivated by his faith as well to spread Christianity. And he sold his case to the Spanish monarchy. And in 1492, they eventually gave in. And so after the conquest of Granada, the Spanish monarchy was looking for new projects to expand their influence overseas. And so he takes 4 ships, Columbus, and he sails across the Atlantic. And in many ways, he got lucky. In fact, his sailors were about to mutiny before he unaccidentally stumbled upon a new set of continents. He actually didn't realize there were a new set of continents. He most likely didn't realize they were even up until his death. He thought that he had just discovered a new trade route to East Asia, to the Indies. In fact, he called the peoples he had conquered Indians, hence the name Indigenous peoples. So, he discovers these continents on accident. It would only be a later explorer that, thought that these were new continents, Amerigo Vespucci, that, that they would realize, oh yeah, these are actually new continents we've discovered. In fact, the Americas was named after this explorer. It's where the term Americas comes from, Amerigo. And thus, from this point on, the scramble to control America is going to begin. By the way, just a couple of images here to help bring this alive for you. So here's Portugal. They sailed around the African continent here over the course of a century, established various colonies such as Guinea, Mozambique, and Angola here along the African coast, as well as colonies on the coast of India and parts of Southeast Asia. So very far-flung empire here. And this is going to motivate the Spanish to engage in their own exploration. And so Columbus, he's going to eventually engage in 4 of these journeys, okay, back and forth. He actually didn't land in the mainlands of North and South America, believe it or not. His activities were in the Caribbean, and specifically the island of Hispaniola, which contains Haiti and the Dominican Republic today, and in Cuba. There, he discovered indigenous peoples. He did not discover for himself vast sums of gold and silver, although him and his sailors heard some tales of the existence of vast sums of mineral wealth throughout this part of the world. And he ended up taking some of these people as slaves and bringing back to Spain. He made up some grand tales about the places he discovered to get funding for another trip. He told a lot of exaggerations in his about his journey to the Spanish monarchy. His legacy is very controversial. On the one hand, he was incredibly brave for taking this journey across the New World, incredibly ambitious. He started this vast exchange known as the Columbian Exchange, the trade of goods and people across the Atlantic, very important moment in world history. But at the same time, he committed bloodshed and violence. He started a process that would eventually lead to genocide in the Caribbean. Most of the peoples in the Caribbean were wiped out by Christopher Columbus, and most of the people there were hunter-gatherers. They didn't have much of an ability to resist the diseases or the European conquest. Thus, most of them were wiped out. So very controversial legacy. Now, the pull factors. Columbus brought back with him great tales of gold and silver. And while a lot of this was based on myth, much of it was based in fact. So in reality, there was a lot of gold and silver mines in the New World, specifically where the Aztec Empire was located in Mexico. We talked about the Aztec Empire last time. See my lecture to learn more about that. In the mines of the Sierra Madre Mountains of what is today Mexico, as well as in the highlands in Central America, we find gold and silver mines, right? And so this is part of what is going to make the Spanish Empire very wealthy in the Americas. The other huge source of gold and silver is going to come from where the Incan Empire was located. The mines there in the Andean mountain ranges had a lot of gold and silver there as well. And so thus, the Spanish are going to be very much attracted to conquering these 2 empires. They had large populations that could be exploited for their labor. They had access to temperate climates with good agricultural lands that could be where you could grow staple crops like corn, for example. But more importantly, they had those resources for export, the gold and silver that they desired. And so thus, this access to lands for mining and agriculture is going to attract settlers from the New World, what we call conquistadors, Spanish conquerors. Now, on top of that, these peoples were polytheists. They didn't believe in one god, they believed in many gods, these indigenous peoples. And thus, there was a desire to thus spread Christianity as a means of justifying this colonization. So this is going to inspire Christian missionaries. And in fact, by the end of this process, most of the peoples in the Americas are going to be converted to Christianity. And while some indigenous traditions are going to be mixed up in the great varieties of Christianity that are going to emerge in the New World, at the end of the day, these polytheistic religions are going to decline pretty quickly in the following centuries. And the Spanish, they thus become motivated to send troops to the New World, conquistadors, in the decades after Columbus's discovery. And so Hernan Cortes, first major group that gets sent over there to conquer the Aztec Empire, starting in 1519. It would take several years to conquer that empire. And then Francisco Pizarro, he's going to conquer the Incan Empire in 15, or start the conquest in 1532. It's actually going to take approximately a half century to conquer that Incan Empire. So these conquistadors get sent over to conquer this part of the world. Okay, and what's important here as well is that the indigenous empires put up fierce resistance, and thus there was a lot of bloodshed and warfare. Millions of people are going to die in the process of this conquest, okay? With the motives of the Spanish being summed up as God, gold, and glory, seeking wealth and fortune and political power, and spreading one's faith. And for the indigenous peoples that survived, okay, if they didn't want to be massacred, converting to Christianity became a necessity. You can see here with this artistic depiction on the right. Now, how did the conquest happen? Well, what's interesting about it, now, it's easy to see why the hunter-gatherers and the subsistence farmers with their small village communities got conquered pretty quickly by the Spanish. But what of the indigenous empires, of the Aztecs and the Incans? Incan Empire, for example, had millions of people. This was a massive empire, no small entity, well organized, good infrastructure, but they eventually lost. Why? Why is it that the Spanish won? And by the way, the Spanish did it with a relatively small number of soldiers. There was, it was not easy convincing people to make this risky journey across the Atlantic. And so Pizarro, Cortez, they did not have massive numbers of troops. So how did these folks do it? How did they conquer these empires? Well, there's a couple of explanations. Part of this did have to do with European technological advances. The Europeans had a couple of tricks up their sleeve that gave them a big advantage. One was guns. So the indigenous peoples, while they had bronze weapons, they did not have guns, and they didn't have access to iron, nor did they have horses, which the Europeans had. So this gave them, the Europeans, a distinct advantage on the battlefield. So that's part of it. But even with those technological advances, okay, they were still vastly outnumbered. And by the way, the guns that existed in those days were still relatively primitive in comparison to today's weapons. The Spanish did not have automatic weapons, okay? So the guns they had were relatively bulky, not easy to reload. So they also had some other advantages, the Europeans. They needed to help them out here. Another advantage they had, and this one was complete luck, was disease. Diseases absolutely decimated indigenous peoples. In fact, it was the biggest cause of death as a result of European colonization. Now, why was this the case? Well, indigenous peoples lacked resistance to old world diseases, okay, in comparison with Europeans in terms of their resistance to New World diseases. Now, why was this the case? Well, a big part of this had to do with the fact that indigenous peoples did not have access to many domesticated animals. Domesticated animals are often a common origin of deadly diseases that impact human beings. So the indigenous peoples were wiped out by things like smallpox, measles, the flu, and other diseases, most of which actually originated from our domesticated animals, such as cows, chickens, sheep, and so on and so forth. So, in fact, the only major disease that the indigenous peoples gave to the Europeans was syphilis, and that spreads via sexual transmission, and that takes a while to kill you, whereas smallpox is something that can kill you very quickly and spreads via the air. So thus there was a great difference, okay, in how these different peoples were affected by each other when they first interacted. Indigenous peoples got wiped out. So over 50 million indigenous peoples died, mostly by disease as well as by warfare and labor exploitation. Now, there's one other factor that's critical here as well. Now, despite the diseases and the gun advantage, that they still had millions of people, the Incans, as well as the Aztec Empire. So the Spanish had one other trick up their sleeve that they used quite well. They played divide and conquer with the indigenous peoples, and this was especially true with the Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire, much like European empires, was quite oppressive. And they conquered a bunch of different peoples. They forced them to convert to their faith. They committed massacres. They exploited them for taxes. And thus the Spanish were able to play into the animosity of the various peoples of the Aztec Empire, to get them on their side and to conquer the Aztec elites. So they played into divide and conquer with these folks. The Spanish, with their small forces, would never have been able to conquer the Incan and Aztec empires without the help of some indigenous peoples. Now, this does not feed into the overly romantic and simplistic narratives of, what we see in certain, Hollywood movies like Pocahontas, or, in terms of, what you see in things like Avatar, right? Where you get these, outside peoples conquering indigenous peoples and taking over their land. It was a bit more complicated than that. Oftentimes, colonizers rely on co-opted indigenous peoples to help them with conquests. This is the way it often plays out, and this was the case with this conquest as well. They made alliances with the enemies of the Aztecs and Incans, and they relied on these folks as translators. They allied them for logistics, to gain knowledge of the land, to learn more about their enemies. So strategic action was critical here. And by the way, the Spanish learned this from their conquest in Europe as well. The Spanish had a diverse, complicated, multi-ethnic empire elsewhere in the world. And so they're going to put those strategic actions into use in the New World as well. In fact, the Spanish conquistadors, so you had a lot of lonely males that traveled to the New World, they're going to intermarry with some of the indigenous elites. They're going to have children with them. Their children are going to produce a new mixed class of people called the mestizo. And so these indigenous elites as well could sometimes assimilate into the new Spanish hierarchy by converting to Christianity and intermarrying with Spanish peoples. So while many indigenous folks were massacred, their labor was exploited, the elites amongst the indigenous peoples were also sometimes able to assimilate. So this is an important part of the story. We cannot understand the Spanish conquest of the Americas without it. And so thus there emerged a new class of people in the Americas. Okay, so along with the indigenous people, we also have the Spanish and this new class of people called the mestizo. And there's going to be a mixing of a lot of Spanish and indigenous culture in the process of this. And by the way, just to highlight some things here for you, there were very few domesticated animals in the New World. In fact, in what we know as Latin America today, the three biggest, so we have the alpaca and the llama on the left, which were useful for transport, but not very good in terms of producing vast quantities of protein like cattle are very good for doing. Now, on the right here, we also have the guinea pig. And when you're third most imported domesticated animal is the guinea pig. You're kind of in trouble when it comes to protein, right? So in fact, the guinea pig, by the way, is still a delicacy in Peru today, interestingly enough. And so while Americans might associate these animals with cuddly domesticated pets, they're actually a source of food in what is today Peru. So this conquest came with a lot of disasters for indigenous peoples. Many were driven off their lands, many were slaughtered, and a far larger number of people died of a disease. And so we could see here, for example, in Mexico, there was a population collapse. You go from having over 20 million indigenous peoples to only approximately 2 million due to death, starvation, disease, warfare that really just gripped Mexico during this era. So a lot of disaster hit this part of the world. Now, while millions of indigenous peoples did survive, as you can see here, far more were wiped out by this process. In other parts of the Americas, they got wiped out completely. So in the Caribbean, the Taino peoples were completely obliterated in the process of all this. Now, because of this vast conquest and bloodshed, the Spanish needed to justify it, right? And they had to justify the murder, the rape, the enslavement, the labor exploitation out of all of this. And they used Christianity to justify it, right? This became the big justification here. For one, the indigenous peoples were pagans. They viewed the spread of disease, deaths, and warfare, some of the conquistadors, as just being a punishment by God. These people deserved it. This is just coming to them. And, this is part of a longer history. This is also how the conquest of Muslim peoples was justified, or discrimination against Jewish peoples. They use this as a reason to justify discrimination against pagans. And they also, as well, justified the conversion of many of these folks based on the need to save their souls. So while not all Spaniards promoted mass rape and murder, others did still promote colonization and, the stripping of indigenous peoples of their cultural heritage, their languages, their religions, and converting them to Christianity as a means to save their souls. Now, for the Spanish that didn't want to massacre those people, there were many Spaniards, for a variety of reasons, that did not want to massacre all these indigenous peoples. For one, they wanted to convert them to Christianity. And number two, they wanted to exploit their labor. And if you're killing them in mass, it's going to be pretty difficult to do this. And the Spanish monarchy wanted to prevent the elimination of these indigenous peoples. They wanted to convert them. Right. So this is important for their power. So they eventually, created what was called the encomienda system. Now, by the way, many Spanish priests did condemn the massacres and the human rights abuses. In fact, I'm going to show you a quote from Bartolomeu de las Casas in a second. They were well aware, many of these people, just how evil these massacres were. So I'm going to get to that in a second. So the Spanish monarchy, they created what was called the encomienda system. And basically what they said is that the Spanish conquistadors, you had to protect the rights of indigenous peoples as long as they converted to Christianity, paid their taxes, and volunteered some of their labor for agricultural projects and mining, right? So this became known as encomienda. It's actually borrowed from a system that the Spanish had used previously in Europe when they conquered non-Christian peoples. So the Muslims got to stay in the Iberian Peninsula as long as they converted to Christianity, for example. And so the indigenous peoples, in some cases, could keep some of their autonomy if they converted and gave tribute. Now, as I said, I know there's a big debate about the impacts of European colonization on the New World today. And while certainly tons of benefits came out of this for the Europeans, for the New World, as well as, in some instances, some indigenous elites, at the end of the day, there was an incredible amount of bloodshed and massacres that we can't ignore. It's a part of the history, and it's still really vigorously argued about today in Latin America and in North America. And so they were well aware of these massacres. Take this quote from Bartolomeu de las Casas, very famous priest, also very prominent political figure during this conquest. He, wrote a lot about this. In fact, he lobbied the Spanish king and queen to create an encomienda system to protect these people from massacres. And he writes here, what we committed in the Indies stands out among the most unpardonable offenses ever committed against God and mankind. And this trade in Indian slaves is one of the most unjust, evil, and cruel among them. So there were a lot of folks that were aware of how awful this was from the very beginning. Okay, it's not just historical context. As a lot of people argue that they couldn't have been possibly aware of how evil the stuff that they were doing. This is nonsense. They were aware of it. They either just justified it, looked the other way, or in some cases even condemned it. There were plenty of Europeans that would emerge as allies of the indigenous people. So we have to keep this in mind here going forward. Very complicated situation. All right, so in the aftermath of this, in conclusion, the Spanish are going to create a new empire. And their first two big colonies in the New World, although others are going to be added, was New Spain, centered on the former Aztec Empire in what would become Mexico City. And this New Spain consisted of Mexico, Central America, and the Spanish Caribbean holdings, as well as Florida. And then we're going to get Peru, otherwise known as New Castilla. It's going to consist of the Andean highlands, what is now Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Colombia, parts of Chile. And, it's going to as well consist of more generally of the Andean highlands and what was the former Incan Empire, based now its capital being Lima. So, and the population of these places was gradually converted to Catholicism, and the Spaniards exploited the indigenous labor for gold, silver, and cash crops. And this would have a great impact on Latin America. It would foster much of the socioeconomic inequality that will continue to exist until the present day in this part of the world. Okay, so that does it for my lecture. Okay, do you want to read more? I highly recommend from a Latin American perspective, an indigenous perspective. I recommend Eduardo Galeano's book, Open Veins of Latin America, written in 1996 and translated in that year. So, highly recommended, great source to read, talks a lot about the travesties of this conquest. So I will see you all for my next lecture. We're going to talk about Portugal and the transatlantic slave trade next time.